center, we have visual confirmation. The plating, it's perfect. No erosion, no micrometeorite damage. It's like it just came off the dock.
It's impossible. It's not an organism. It's an algorithm. But you disappeared 20 years ago.
No, only 32 days.
They're changing! Get them out of here! No! No!
You're not them.
If you found us, that means we've always been here.
The Valiant was never supposed to come back. For 20 years, it had existed as little more than a memory, a cautionary tale, a footnote in the records of humanity's failed attempts at deep space exploration. It had been filed under irrecoverable loss in every aerospace archive, marked as yet another vessel swallowed by the void. The Valiant was gone. Forever, until it wasn't. Now, impossibly, it hung in orbit over the Pacific Recovery Zone, its hull gleaming under the station's floodlights, looking pristine, as if it had never been lost at all. That was the problem. I stood inside Observation Chamber 4, staring at the live telemetry feed broadcasting from the ship's exterior plating. Every data stream confirmed the same impossible truth. No micrometeoroid scarring, no thermal erosion from atmospheric exposure, no prolonged radiation wear. Even in the vacuum of space, 20 years should have left some mark. An accumulation of interstellar dust, minor stress fractures from undetected oscillations, even minuscule atomic displacements due to prolonged exposure. But there was nothing. It was as if the Valiant had been plucked from the very moment of its disappearance and set back into the present, untouched by time. I glanced at the mission logs again, though I knew the dates by heart. Launch date, 2057. Declared lost, 2059. Returned, 2079. The numbers didn't add up. The ship had been missing for 20 years, but to the naked eye it had returned in the exact condition it had left in. Someone had made a joke earlier, too loudly, that it was like seeing a dead man walk through the front door wearing the same suit he was buried in. No one had laughed. The absurdity of it wasn't funny. It was terrifying. My name is Nathaniel Kessler, forensic astrophysicist for the Aerospace Anomaly Response Division, AARD. My team doesn't deal with conventional disasters. That's for the recovery units and mission controllers. We investigate unaccountable returns, telemetry paradoxes, the black box data that contradicts reality itself. When something comes back that shouldn't exist, we find out why. And right now I was staring at the most unexplainable case of my career. The Valiant wasn't just intact, it was immaculate. But what was inside? The ship's crew had been scheduled for re-entry, but no one was ready to welcome them home just yet. Instead, the station's command had initiated a controlled docking sequence, moving the Valiant into a reinforced containment bay, where it would remain sealed until we understood what had happened to it. The official reason for keeping them in quarantine was decontamination protocol. The real reason was uncertainty. Because the first irregularity wasn't just the ship's impossible condition, it was the men inside it. The moment the flight surgeon received their biometric scans, a quiet tension gripped the control room. Their DNA signatures weren't exact matches. They were close. Close enough that an automatic scan wouldn't have flagged the discrepancy. Close enough that in any other scenario, someone might have chalked it up to a calibration error and moved on. But this wasn't any other scenario. The Valiant had vanished for 2 decades, yet its crew insisted that only 32 days had passed for them. There was a knock against the observation chamber's reinforced glass. I turned to see Dr. Edward Langley, arms folded across his chest, the exhaustion of too many sleepless shifts lining his face. He was the lead specialist in quantum displacement studies, a field that had gained far too much attention since the Valiant's return. He jerked his head toward the quarantine chamber entrance. "They're ready for preliminary interview," he said. I exhaled slowly, centering my thoughts. Then I stepped through the decontamination corridor to meet the men who had been presumed dead for 20 years. The Valiant's crew should have been dead. 20 years was long enough for their names to be carved into memorial plaques, their faces immortalized in the archives of failed space missions. They had families who had mourned them, children who had grown up never expecting to see them again. They weren't supposed to be here, and yet they were. Seated inside quarantine control, sealed behind reinforced medical decontamination chambers, were 6 men who had vanished into deep space 2 decades ago. They were alive, breathing, conscious, but something was wrong. I stood in the observation room, a thick sheet of shatterproof glass separating me from them. The live biometric feeds displayed in front of me flickered with fluctuating data, indicators shifting too precisely, too methodically. Everything about them was almost right. Almost. I had studied these men. I had seen their pre-flight psych evaluations, their mission briefing footage, the high-resolution stills taken before launch. I had committed their faces to memory, their ages, their mannerisms, their physical condition at the time of departure. The men in the quarantine chamber were them, but not exactly. Their posture was too rigid, their expressions too measured. The uniforms they wore had been pulled from the ship's supply lockers, yet they looked unworn, as if they had never been used. Their faces held a careful, deliberate stillness, a kind of composure that felt practiced rather than natural. And their biometrics didn't match. They were close, so close that casual scans hadn't flagged the discrepancies. But when Langley and the medical team ran deeper analyses, the variances became impossible to ignore. Blood composition, muscle density, resting heart rates, all just slightly off. The lead flight surgeon had been the first to notice it. "They're similar," he had muttered, staring at the data. "But they're not identical." That was enough to keep them locked away. Their return had been impossible. But what was even more terrifying was that the people inside that ship might not be the same men who had left. Captain Warren Monroe sat at the center of the quarantine chamber, hands folded neatly in his lap, his expression perfectly neutral. He had been 43 years old when he launched. Now, after 20 years, he should have been 63, but he wasn't. He looked exactly the same as he had at the moment of departure. I took a breath and tapped the intercom. "Captain Monroe," I said, keeping my voice neutral, professional. Do you understand why you and your crew are under extended quarantine? Monroe lifted his head, meeting my gaze through the glass. You're verifying mission discrepancies, he said smoothly. Ensuring no biological contamination, no cognitive degradation due to prolonged deep space exposure. We expected as much. I didn't react, but Langley shifted slightly beside me, his fingers tightening over the biometric control panel. There was something too prepared about Monroe's response. I tapped my fingers against my tablet, choosing my next words carefully. Captain, before your disappearance, you filed a distress signal. Final telemetry showed a sudden propulsion failure, followed by complete loss of communications. After that, nothing. We searched for 6 years before terminating recovery efforts. I paused, watching his reaction. Now you're here, 20 years later. Do you understand how that looks? Monroe didn't blink. His expression remained calm, composed, unwavering. It looks impossible, he said simply. His voice was measured, his confidence unshaken. He believed what he was saying. Then tell me, I pressed, what do you remember? Monroe exchanged a glance with his crew, and then, as if on cue, they all nodded in unison. The movement was too synchronized, too perfectly timed. A slow, uneasy chill crept up my spine. Then Monroe exhaled. 32 days, Kessler, he said. That's how long it's been for us. I felt Langley go rigid beside me. We conducted standard deep space navigational tests, Monroe continued, voice even. Encountered a subspace anomaly during a routine trajectory adjustment, and then he hesitated. Exactly 1 second. We were here. There was no change in vocal intonation, no attempt to explain the gaps in logic, just a statement of fact presented with absolute certainty. Langley leaned forward slightly, whispering under his breath, "They actually believe it." I switched tactics. "What's the last thing you remember before arrival?" Monroe didn't hesitate this time. "Reviewing the ship's systems, all functional, no recorded malfunctions, no indication that anything was wrong." I kept my expression neutral. "Then why did your distress signal indicate a total propulsion failure?" Monroe's expression didn't flicker. "That must be an error," he said. Beside me, Langley's jaw tightened. Before I could press further, a quiet chime sounded, a biometric alert from the central medical feed. Langley's entire body stiffened. I turned to the display. Monroe's medical scan had just updated, and his vitals were fluctuating. Langley leaned in, voice tight. "Hold on. His blood chemistry just shifted. Mid-test." Monroe blinked at him, his crew sitting perfectly still beside him. "That's impossible," Monroe said. Langley stared at the screen. The live biometric feed displayed real-time physiological data, and Monroe's readout was changing. His blood oxygen levels cycled through a precise rhythmic variation, as if following an unseen algorithm rather than biological randomness. His heart rate held steady for exactly 43 seconds, then adjusted by 2 beats per minute, before reversing the change at the same interval. Even his body temperature fluctuated by a precise 1/10 of a degree every 90 seconds, a level of consistency that had no biological explanation. It wasn't an anomaly of failure, it was an anomaly of intent. Monroe met Langley's gaze, his face expressionless. There must be a system malfunction, he said, as if stating an obvious fact. Langley tapped the data screen with the back of his knuckle. This isn't a mechanical error, he said. You've been scanned twice. The readout is changing in real time. Monroe didn't move. I feel fine. I studied him. There was no sign of distress, no sweat, no rapid breathing, nothing suggesting he was aware of any biological inconsistency. But my mind latched onto something more unsettling, the absence of reaction itself. A normal astronaut would have been concerned that their body wasn't registering properly, but Monroe was calm, too calm. Langley exhaled sharply and pulled up Monroe's pre-mission biometric records. Your resting BPM at launch was 63, he muttered. It's 60 now. Minor variance, sure, but your plasma protein levels are down 5.2%. There is no physiological condition known to medical science that would naturally induce those changes over a 4-week period. Monroe remained still. And yet, here I am. A slow, heavy silence settled over the chamber. Langley's voice was a whisper. They're not just close. He stared at the fluctuating data. They're still adjusting. The station was coming apart. Not in any way that could be measured. Not in a way that the emergency systems could register or the safety protocols could counteract. But it was happening nonetheless, and we knew it. The air felt thicker, reality stretching at its edges like a film pulled too thin. The walls were still there, the consoles still humming, the corridors still holding their form. But the more I focused on them, the less certain I was that they were real. Langley gripped the edge of the console beside me, his knuckles white. His breathing was sharp, erratic. I could tell he was feeling it too, that creeping, sickening sensation that something fundamental had shifted, and we were no longer standing inside the place we had always believed to be solid and certain. Inside the quarantine chamber, the crew, or whatever they had become, stood in silence. Their forms looked human, but the illusion was fraying at the edges. Captain Monroe was the first to move. It was slow, deliberate, as if he was testing the motion itself, ensuring that his limbs still functioned as expected. But the way he turned his head, just a fraction too smooth, just a hair out of sync with the flow of time around him, was wrong. His lips parted, but the words that came out didn't come from his mouth. They came from the station itself, not through the speakers, not through any identifiable source. They just existed, vibrating through the floor, through the walls, through the air itself. You were never supposed to see us. Langley sucked in a sharp breath beside me. Monroe's jaw hadn't moved. None of them had spoken, yet the words had been said. I forced my voice to remain steady. Who are you? Monroe's lips curled into something that wasn't a smile, but wanted to be one. We are what comes after. The air felt different now, like it was pressing inward, reshaping itself around us. Behind Monroe, the other crew members began to shift. Their bodies unfolded, stretching slightly in ways that human anatomy shouldn't allow. Their rib cages expanded and contracted without breath. Their hands twitched, fingers flexing like they were remembering what movement was supposed to feel like. Langley reached for the security override. His hands were shaking. "We need to jettison the chamber," he whispered. I didn't move. Something held me there, not physically but mentally, as if the very thought of fleeing was being scrubbed away the moment it surfaced. Monroe stepped forward. His movements lagged just a fraction of a second behind where they should have been. "You think you are observers," the voice, not Monroe's, whispered through the station. "You are not." A crack split through the glass of the observation window. Not from impact, not from pressure. It fractured outward, the edges of reality straining under something unseen. Langley slammed his hand on the emergency ejection panel. Nothing happened. The system had registered the command, but the function had been rewritten, repurposed into something else, because the station itself was no longer entirely ours. I turned my attention back to Monroe, to the crew, to the things that had once been them but weren't anymore. "Where have you been?" I asked. My voice felt distant, detached. Monroe didn't blink. "Everywhere." The lights flickered. The floor vibrated beneath us. Not tremors, not movement, but something more profound. A change in the fabric of where we were standing. Langley was panicking now, pressing buttons, trying to override whatever was happening. "It's rewriting the station," he hissed. "It's changing the way it exists. We have to stop it." And then it happened. A ripple. A slow, warping distortion that spread through the room like a heat wave passing through solid matter. The walls stretched. The ceiling pulled away. The floor fell out from beneath us, and yet we did not fall. Because there was no down anymore. Only a vast and endless space, stretching out in all directions, neither light nor dark, but something in between. And we were inside it. Langley let out a strangled sound beside me, but I couldn't look at him. Because Monroe was still standing there, watching us, his form still holding shape, but just barely. The illusion was breaking apart, unraveling at the seams, because he had never been here at all, because they had never returned at all. And yet, somehow, they had always been here. I forced my mind to hold on to itself, to resist whatever was trying to reshape me, to make me understand something I wasn't built to comprehend. But Monroe leaned forward, his presence pressing against my mind, and he whispered something, so softly that it didn't touch my ears, only my thoughts. "You were always meant to join us." I clawed at the thought, shoved it away, refused to let it take root. Langley wasn't as strong. I heard his breath stutter, felt his presence shift, his posture change. I turned to him, already knowing what I would see. His eyes were too wide apart. His jaw had lengthened. His ribs were beginning to separate. "Langley," I said, my voice cracking. His gaze flicked to me. There was something else inside him now, something wearing his body like a template, trying to adjust the pieces to make them fit. He opened his mouth, but he didn't speak. Instead, he smiled, a perfect, hollow imitation of what a human expression was supposed to look like. And then I understood. The Valiant never returned. What came back was never meant to be found. The station shuddered, its very structure losing cohesion. We were no longer standing in orbit. We were nowhere at all. I felt my body begin to stretch, to pull apart at the edges, not painfully, but inevitably, like my shape was no longer fixed, like I was something that had been meant to change all along. Monroe stepped closer. The world rippled. Reality thinned. And then everything disappeared.